Today's guest is Michael Fasanello. He's a crypto compliance officer at AnChain.AI, and he has spent 10 years working within the public sector with the Department of Treasury and the Department of Justice in this interesting area that I'm looking forward to hearing more about. Thanks for joining me today, Michael.
Oh, thanks for having me on the Geek Within. Really appreciate it.
For those who don't know you, please share a bit about your background, who you are, what you do, and where you're from.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike Fasanello, crypto compliance officer at AnChain.AI. Like you said, spent about a decade in the U.S. government with Departments of Treasury and Department of Justice. With Justice, I was with the asset forfeiture and money laundering section of the criminal division down in D.C. for a little bit. Jumped around from there to civil division, environmental torts litigation, armed services board of contract appeals. Wow. You name it, I did it. It was a lot of jumping around on different contracts and also a lot of fun while down there. But I wanted to sort of get back to the counter illicit finance roots of the anti-money laundering and asset forfeiture work. And so that led me to taking a job on a contract over at Treasury with the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. And as you know, they're the sanctions enforcement arm of the federal government. So I spent a little bit of time there as a licensing officer, reviewing everything from requests to unblock block funds and blocked assets, special licenses for attorneys to represent narco traffickers like El Chapo and others. Just a lot of really interesting work there. And then, you know, as I had started to round out the asset forfeiture and money laundering with the sanctions work, I said, well, there's also Bank Secrecy Act and financial compliance that FinCEN does. So I hopped over to a contract over at FinCEN. And during my time at FinCEN, halfway through, I was actually converted from a contractor to a full-time federal employee. So that was sort of another green check on the box. As contractors, we're always sort of striving to go blue, as they used to call it, and you know, get that federal badge without the contractor logo on there.
Right.
Yeah. So that was the bulk of my career, and then before that, went to law school and had a couple of odd jobs in like family law and process service and stuff like that. So
that's interesting. So have you going back to when you were in high school and you're trying to decide what to do after high school, did you always want to go into law?
Yeah, so I mean, I was one of those weird kids that, like, when they were 5 or 6 years old, knew what they wanted to do. It was pretty much either a lawyer or a cop. Eventually, as I grew, that sort of developed further into either a federal prosecutor, and after that, I figured I would do like five years prosecution as like an AUSA, assisting United States attorney, and then I would hop the fence and do criminal defense, because that's where the money is. And if I wasn't going to do that, I thought some sort of federal agent. At the time, FBI was like, you know, the premier law enforcement agency, and so that was the long-term goal for a long time, was getting into the FBI. I had a variety of like internship applications and things like that. Actually, the first contract I was supposed to be on over at Justice, when I was in law school, I was offered a contract up in New York with the New York field office to work in their language intelligence division, I think as a research analyst or something. But I had to turn that down because I was in law school. And once you're halfway through law school, you're not turning around.
Right.
So
that's interesting. So you always want to be a lawyer, always wanted to work in the criminal space, criminal justice space.
Yeah.
How did you land that first job? Was it through an internship or through somebody you knew?
Yeah, so I had a bunch of jobs. Like when I was working ever since I could get that paper and your parents sign off on it and you go work for somebody, right? Like that. I always wanted. Well, I'm kind of a guy that likes to spend a lot, so I always wanted to work real hard, earn a lot, and then spend a lot. So,
Sure.
So yeah, ever since I could work, I was working. Even a little bit before then, I think I was doing like mowing lawns. I had like Mike's landscaping service. I did snowballing in the winter, like leaf raking in the fall. So I was always working super hard, just like money and like stuff you could do with it. But as far as the true like beginning of my professional career, I would say coming out of high school, I had an internship down with the prosecutor's office, Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office. That internship sort of followed after high school into college a little bit. And then after college, between college and law school, I worked for a law firm in New York called Wilson Elser, Moskowitz, Edelman, and Dicker. We used to call it WeMed because nobody wanted to say that 5 times fast. So I was like a paralegal assistant or legal assistant or something like that in New York. Did the whole commute thing from New Jersey back and forth with my dad. It was a lot of fun because my dad worked in the city. So that was probably the beginning of my professional legal career, if you would. And then, of course, went to law school and graduated in 2010 and came out right into like the aftermath of the financial crisis. A lot of firms were bleeding attorneys. They were not hiring. So right after law school, I had like two kind of odd jobs. One was working with a career institute, Kaplan, out in Pittsburgh. I was teaching criminal justice to career students, and then I was also working with a family lawyer, sole practitioner out here, doing process service and law clerk duties and all sorts of fun stuff. I mean, like one day I'd be, helping her draft a brief, and the next day I'd be like trying to serve papers on somebody with like 6 bulldogs in their backyard, 6 Rottweilers in their backyard. It was really interesting.
That is interesting. It's interesting that you get to see that aspect of the law, right? Of the
Oh
criminal,
yeah.
right? That you have to be served. Somebody's got to serve them. It's interesting that you experienced that. So criminal justice, I get it, right? I understand criminal justice. How does that then turn into this financial aspect of it? How did that interest come about?
Yeah, and that was really the crux of it. Was when I was working those 2 odd jobs, I was like, all right, so like take the bar exam. I took that in a couple of different states, and then I was like, really nobody's hiring for lawyers anyway at this point in time. So I always had those two options, like federal agent or lawyer. So I was looking at a lot of the federal contractors down in DC, and one of those contractors picked me up as a law clerk / senior paralegal at the U.S. Attorney's Office down in DC in their criminal division, asset forfeiture and money laundering section. It's called AFMILS back then. Now it's MLARS, the money laundering and asset recovery section. So a couple of people may know it from the former name. I don't know. They're OGs if they know it as AFMELs, and if they call it MLARS, I know they're newbies.
So that introduced you into the criminal financial stuff.
Yeah, they were doing both criminal forfeiture and civil forfeiture. Criminal forfeiture is super easy. Somebody gets convicted, automatically proceeds of the crime, boom, they just get forfeited. So it's not too difficult in most cases. It's rare that somebody gets convicted and somehow the defense attorney is able to save those assets. In fact, almost never if they're criminal proceeds. So mostly it's like defense attorneys trying to prove that they're not derived from criminal acts. But the curious part for me was civil forfeiture, which is actually, regardless of what happens in the criminal case, they usually need a conviction to attach it. But the fun part was seeing the assets themselves named as the defendant in the suit. So it would be like United States government versus $200,000 in old pennies or something. Like it was a really interesting world of civil forfeiture where the government is actually suing the assets themselves to usurp them into the legal process and attach them, and the marshal service then takes custody of them. It was really fascinating for me. But then in some of those cases, like there would be a money laundering aspect, there would be a sanctions aspect, there would be a Bank Secrecy Act violation or something like that. So it was always, the DC office working with, of course, law enforcement, whether it's FBI, DEA, any of those alphabet soup agencies, but then also they would sometimes pull in FinCEN, they would pull in OFAC, and so that sort of gave me the route, the path that I eventually would follow, because I knew I wanted to make counter illicit finance my true career. So
Interesting. So as you were navigating that career, then what's the decision point for moving to another company, or to as you're trying to decide like I'm building my career, I'm trying to get experience in these various things. I want to get paid more, right? And we all know sometimes that means leaving to go someplace new. How did those, what kind of decisions did you leverage as you were trying to kind of navigate that?
like you said, I mean, the pay is always, I think, especially when you're starting out your career, like probably most people feel underpaid, undervalued, especially if you come out like with, coming out with a law degree and then like making 50K, you're like, what's going on here?
Right.
Because I had friends who were lucky enough to land jobs with top white shoe law firms, and they'd make $100 grand or 150 grand or whatnot. So I'm sitting there like making 56,000. I think I made down in DC, and it was, especially for DC, like it was rough to live on 56,000. Granted, I didn't have a family at that time or a kid, and now I have my wife and our son Roman, who's turning 4 in October, and then we're expecting one in September. So
Wow.
whole different scenario. But yeah, I just I knew that it was like you had to always keep one line in the water while you're doing what you're doing with the other line. So the interesting part was I didn't really have to chase these opportunities. They were pretty fruitful in the Beltway, like the Beltway bandits, as they're called. They always have something for you, you know? So I would get calls just like, once, twice a week, sometimes even, even more frequently. And, you get those opportunities, like, for example, when I was with CACI, they offered me a opportunity at the Solicitor General's office, which, as you might know, that's where the U.S. sends their attorneys to actually argue cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. So it was really interesting to see all the cases that, as a legal nerd, as a law school
Right.
graduate, like you look at Law 360 all the time, or the Bar Association news and things like that. Oh, it's going to be in the Supreme Court. Oh, so and so's going to the Supreme Court, and then I'm actually there, like supporting the litigators as they go through the process of putting those cases forth. Wonderful, wonderful attorneys, just the cream of the crop, and as you would expect, the U.S. would select for that forum. But I think what was also unique about it, as with a lot of things in DC, like the buildings are old and a lot of things are preserved, not nearly like they are in Europe, but we're only 200 years old here. But,
Right.
to see our attorneys having to put on morning coats where they had the two coattails coming to go argue for the Supreme Court was awesome. But even jobs like that, there's still certain things that can lure you away. So still with khaki, so with CACI, they offered me another contract on environmental torts litigation, where, like, and I can finally talk about the case because it's been so long, and it already came to, it was already closed out, but back then I couldn't really discuss it. It was a Bureau of Prisons third party contractor called like Unicor or something. They were recycling old TV screens, computers, all sorts of electronic equipment down in Florida, and the inmates were to put to work, recycling these technology hardware. But they didn't follow OSHA standards. They didn't have all the stuff that they should have had to protect themselves from all the
Shock.
heavy metals and like the lead or mercury or things like that. So they folks got really sick, and the family sued, and so that was an interesting case I took, or went to support the attorneys on that case. And then I got lured away from there because, of course, during the financial crisis with the S&P Moody's and the ratings process and all that stuff, well, sure enough, the government sued Moody's and S&P, and so yeah, they had a case going on there, out of California versus New York, and so I went to support that case. It was just like one thing after the next. It was always something newsworthy, something cool to work on. So I never really stayed in one place too long as a contractor down there.
That's interesting. Is that typical for somebody in law? Right. I don't talk to a lot of lawyers. I mean, my sister's a lawyer, but we don't talk about that. We talk about family stuff, right?
Mhm.
Is that typical as you're going through your career to kind of flow to where the interesting action is?
I mean, like, it depends on what field of law. I think, criminal law, you're always going to have something interesting because people just do the strange things sometimes. And then federal criminal law is even worse because you really get like the worst of the worst doing stuff. So if you're able to stomach that type of stuff, then you'll always have something interesting to work on. Wills, trust, and estates. Maybe you're super interested in those kinds of details, and that floats your boat. But like, yeah, I think that law does, because it touches so many parts of society, it does bring you so many opportunities that you might not otherwise experience in a different career. Like, if you're, an ER nurse, well, ER nurses are pretty exciting, I'm sure, but yeah, something that's a little less exciting, I guess.
Sure. So then how did you get into crypto?
Crypto, wow. So having the 10-year career in counter illicit finance, counter threat finance, Bank Secrecy Act, all that stuff, I hopped out of FinCEN, was the last government job. Hopped out of there and went to, actually, right down the road from FinCEN's DC office, like on the other corner of the same block that FinCEN's DC building is on. Bitrex Exchange had their sole compliance team of like 8 or 10 people. They're like a Seattle-based exchange. Everybody is out in Seattle, and they just had this pod of compliance folks out in DC. Probably is situated close to FinCEN for a reason. But they, so they hired me, and my wife was pregnant with our son at the time, and so sadly, like, I left them after, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks. It was really, really quick, because we had intended to leave DC to raise our family, back home in Pittsburgh, where we are now. A little bit calmer life, in some ways cleaner and just less political, and like everything is, I think, just the way we wanted it for our sons. So I did not expect jobs to come up with the traditional financial institutions in Pittsburgh in counter-illicit finance as quickly as they did. So First National Bank offered me a job on their AML sanctions team, basically to come and revamp their whole sanctions program with sectoral sanctions, including Russia and Venezuela and the oil programs and things like that. So that lured me away from Bittrex, mostly because of the relocation opportunity, but also just something else in traditional finance. Traditional finance bored me after like 2 years. I did a year at First National Bank. I did a year at PNC Bank, overseeing a department of anywhere between 15 and 30 transaction monitoring specialists doing anti-money laundering and sanctions, red flag reviews. And after that, I was just like, it's really stuffy, really boring. It was a lot of the same bureaucracy and red tape that you experience in government with the big banks.
Sure.
And so I wanted to do something new. I knew crypto when I was in law school was like an up and coming thing. I was starting to hear more rumbles about it in 2018, 2019 when I was with PNC. PNC didn't really want to have anything to do with it. So I was like, well, if PNC hates it, it must be awesome. So, so I took a course. I took a course at one of AnChain's, currently one of AnChain's competitors. And I liked the course so much that I went to the president of the company and basically said, hey, I would love to keep this thing going, keep it modern, update it as needed, even teach this thing in person. So after about 8 weeks, I got an offer to work with that company. I was their director of training and regulatory affairs. And so I learned a ton about crypto. Like, they're a competitor. I had my own, thoughts about the company, but the one thing I can say is they really taught me a lot about this field. Like, it was almost like boot camp. I mean, in the roughly the year that I was there, it was like 10 years in a different field. So I really got very, very saturated with blockchain technology, crypto, digital assets, to the point where like media journalists were reaching out, and just like now I'm on a podcast. Like, I'm only about 3 years into my knowledge of crypto, and I'm able to speak intelligibly about it most days. If I have enough coffee, I'm pretty sharp. But yeah, I think for some people it's a very difficult, complex subject. They can't get it, and they'll just be happy going to an exchange, letting the exchange do what they do, and they'll just buy their crypto that way. For me, it clicks different. I never really considered myself like a techie guy. Like IT stuff. Like my wife's brother does IT networking and stuff like that. And so for me, it was hearing these terms and stuff like that, but in a different context. And they never really piqued my interest until now that I'm seeing some of those same terms pop up in crypto. We're dealing with smart contracts. We're dealing with a lot of different protocols, back-end coding, front-end coding, UI, UX, all these different things that before like bored the heck out of me. But now, because it's applied to crypto, it's it's got a little bit of sheen to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And crypto is, I mean, for people who have never really messed with it, right? They probably heard of Bitcoin because everybody's heard of Bitcoin, but it's really like a commodity, right? It's like commodity trading almost.
Yeah, that's the thing is, and like the war, if you would, between the agencies in DC. The CFTC wants to do their thing with it. SEC wants to, look at it from the securities perspective. Listen, that's understandable. Yeah, everybody has their mandate. Everybody has the legal statute and authority under which they operate. And so, sure, the SEC is going to look at this thing as a security. CFTC is going to look at it as a commodity. But knowing the technology and the way it functions, I think what I really hope eventually, comes to light in that they accept it as true. Like, where industry is trying to get this across to the agencies is that it really needs to be a multi-pronged approach. It has to be a multi-agency approach. Like, I would love to see what happened with the intelligence community after 9/11, when we found out how many things were siloed, nobody was sharing intel. It was dangerous because of how close hold those agencies were keeping that intel. Same thing with crypto, like have the SEC, the CFTC, FinCEN, OCC, FDIC, and the Fed, have them all on one task force to deal with this. Because guess what? When you're dealing with these digital assets, depending on how they transfer from either party to party or even within the technology itself, if somebody is, swapping assets from one to another, it could change from a commodity to a security to a currency to a collectible. Like it can be different things depending on the use case. So I really like it. If anybody out there is listening from any of those agencies, the one thing that I would really hope to impart is that it's going to take a whole of government approach to get this thing done right. And I would really, really love for the U.S. to be able to be one of the leaders in the regulatory and compliance space for crypto, because we're seeing a lot of businesses that could be bringing a lot of revenue to the U.S. go overseas now because of the stagnant regulatory environment. And the other piece of it is we really want to be in control of how this thing develops from a counter illicit finance point of view, because if we're not the ones corralling this, that means others overseas will be, and hopefully it's our allies, but it could also be our enemies, right? So, it really behooves us to sort of get this right in the short term.
Interesting. So as you've gone through your career and you've had opportunities at a variety of places, what's something you've witnessed that you wish we did different, your field would do differently, right? Or maybe the change that you're thinking about might be too large, and you just need people to start thinking, hey, we need to consider doing this differently. What might that be for you?
So, in terms of the crypto industry, obviously, like I talked about the whole of government approach from the agency's perspective, from congressionally, like they need to have that framework established as quickly as possible, and it's not that difficult. Take the framework that you've used for traditional finance, and that's worked, and begin to put it into place, even as a skeletal system. Because I know, like, it's not a one size fits all. And it's certainly not going to, fit digital assets to regulate them exactly as traditional finance. It doesn't work. But it also doesn't take too much to get intelligent, well thought out, clear guidelines on the books. Because some of these proposals that come out of Congress, it's like, okay, so we're going to regulate crypto by not allowing anybody to self-custody. Well, that defeats the whole purpose of crypto, and it also doesn't really get at the heart of the illicit finance that you're trying to stop anyway. So, things like that. It's just I'd like the stakeholders to take it more seriously and really learn the technology. Like, how do you regulate something you don't understand? Like, you're just going to leave that to your staffers and people that like, you should take some responsibility, because we sent you to DC for a reason. So that's my soapbox speech for that. In a different part of government, I remember one thing that frustrated me at OFAC was a lot of the sanctions policies didn't have as much of a loophole for citizens as I would have expected. And so there was actually one case where, fortunately, my boss, I was mid-career, so maybe I was more brazen and aggressive with it than I should have been. But my boss was a hell of a guy, and he allowed me to take the case down to legal and say, listen, our U.S. citizen sent $2,500 to her sister down in Venezuela, and the sanctions program for Venezuela doesn't have the same exception that the Russia program does, for example, where if you've sent to a sanctioned bank, if you send to a party, somehow there's a sanctions touch point, but it was unintentional and the parties didn't have knowledge of that, they could get their money back. And so to have one program where if the person sent it in one country, they would have got their money back, no question, from the federal government. And in another country, because they did the same exact thing, but the program is written differently, statutes didn't written differently, this person now has blocked assets. And this is not a person, from what I can tell, of means. And so, she was begging us to release these funds. But fortunately, my boss was good enough. I was one of the few bosses that really listened to the employees. That's another thing that I would say is, like, if you've got great people working on your team, there's there's something about being humble enough to know you don't know everything. You're not a perfect person. So be open to what some of your subject matter experts, or, even just, people that are, doing routine, mundane work on your team, just processing it every day. Because guess what? When you're sitting behind a desk doing what you do administratively and somebody else is doing the grunt work, they're going to experience things that they could find could be more efficient, could be, helped out, to make life better for other people. And so, those are, I guess, two areas I'd love to see improved in work life.
Yeah, those are great. So what's next for AnChain.AI, or what's next for you? What's coming up here in the near future?
Oh boy, we're drinking from a fire hose over to AnChain.AI. We are distinguishing ourselves very much from traditional blockchain analytics companies. A lot of people are like, "Oh, so you're like a so-and-so," and we're like, "No, not really. Like, we offer that. We offer blockchain analytics, we offer blockchain tracing and graphing and all that cool stuff. But we're really getting into the cutting edge piece of blockchain, which is smart contracts, smart contract auditing, and just code evaluation, vulnerabilities, threat intelligence. And we're actually building something called Web3 SOC. We're taking the SOC 2 compliance framework, if you would, and applying that to Web3. So it's called Web3 SOC. We actually have a patent on that name. So it's going to be pretty cool to see if we can get an industry to, an emerging industry like this to really embrace that type of security and risk management. So that's what we're working on right now. And we're a startup. We're coming up on our 5-year anniversary. So we all wear like 15 hats. even as now I'm on on a podcast here, so doing that marketing and communications thing, and then I'll hop off this call and deal with one of our sales managers has some questions. So there's always something to work on. And as you saw with my background, I'm no stranger to hopping around one foot to the next and doing all sorts of different things. So I think I'm just not a guy that likes monotony. I like a lot of fresh things and excitement in my days and weeks. So this will keep me busy for some time.
That's awesome. Well, Michael, thank you for coming on the podcast today and educating us a little bit about the space you work in and what's going on, and looking forward to seeing what AnChain.AI can do.
No, it was a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.